Hi, I'm Rebecca. Today I want to share a story that will change how you think about trust, resilience, and the power of speaking your truth when it matters most. This is the story of what happened when I attended what I thought was my sister's dream wedding, only to discover that the man she was about to marry was actually my husband, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. The moment I realized the truth, I had to make a choice that would either destroy my family forever or reveal secrets that needed to be exposed. What I did next shocked everyone in that church, but it taught me the most important lesson about standing up for yourself even when the whole world seems against you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cream-colored invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the casual indifference of regular mail, despite containing the power to completely alter the trajectory of my carefully rebuilt life. Rebecca Martinez, the name printed in elegant calligraphy across the envelope, represented the person I had become over the past 3 years. Independent, successful, and determinedly moving forward from a past that had nearly destroyed me. Inside the envelope lay my younger sister Vanessa's wedding invitation, announcing her engagement to someone named David Thompson. The date was set for June 15th at St. Catherine's Cathedral in downtown Portland, followed by a reception at the prestigious Riverside Manor. The invitation was expensive, elaborate, and everything Vanessa had always dreamed of having for her special day. Yet something about receiving it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread that I could not immediately understand or explain. Vanessa and I had maintained minimal contact since I relocated to Seattle, following the dissolution of my marriage and the mysterious disappearance of my husband Michael. The decision to distance myself from my family had been both practical and necessary. My parents had never fully understood the circumstances surrounding Michael's departure, and their constant questions and unsolicited advice had made healing impossible while remaining in close proximity to their well-intentioned but ultimately harmful concern. The 3 years since Michael's disappearance had been simultaneously the most challenging and transformative period of my entire life. At 28 years old, I had been forced to rebuild my identity, career, and financial security from nothing, while processing the psychological trauma of abandonment and betrayal. Michael had vanished without explanation one morning in September, leaving behind only a brief note stating that he needed time to figure things out and would contact me when he was ready to discuss our future together. The initial months following Michael's departure had been characterized by a devastating combination of hope and despair that alternated unpredictably throughout each day. I had maintained his belongings exactly as he left them, continued paying both halves of our shared expenses, and declined social invitations while waiting for communication that never materialized. The financial strain of maintaining our lifestyle alone had eventually forced me to sell our house and move into a smaller apartment, each downsizing decision representing another step away from the life we had built together. Professional rebuilding had required me to develop capabilities and confidence I had never previously needed or possessed. During my marriage to Michael, I had worked part-time as a graphic designer while he managed our finances and made major household decisions. His disappearance had forced me to assume complete responsibility for every aspect of my existence. From negotiating with creditors to filing tax returns to managing investment accounts I had never fully understood while Michael handled such matters. The career transformation that accompanied my personal rebuilding had proven more successful than I could have imagined during those initial months of panic and uncertainty. My graphic design skills, combined with the determination born from necessity, had enabled me to establish a freelance business that eventually grew into a small but profitable design agency. By the time Vanessa's wedding invitation arrived, I employed 3 part-time designers and managed client relationships with several mid-sized corporations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The decision to attend Vanessa's wedding required careful consideration of both practical and emotional factors. Our relationship had become increasingly strained during the years following Michael's disappearance, partly due to my geographic relocation, but primarily because of fundamental differences in how we approached relationships and personal responsibility. Vanessa had always been the favored daughter, beautiful and charming, but lacking the discipline and independence that our parents had demanded from me as the older child. Vanessa's romantic history consisted of a series of relationships with men who provided financial support and social status, while she focused on maintaining her appearance and social connections. rather than developing professional skills or personal independence. Her engagement to David Thompson appeared to follow this established pattern, though she had been unusually secretive about the details of their relationship and his background compared to her typical enthusiasm for sharing romantic developments with family members. The financial implications of attending Vanessa's wedding were significant but manageable given my improved circumstances. The travel expenses, accommodation costs, and appropriate attire would require careful budgeting, but I had worked diligently to establish an emergency fund that could absorb such unexpected expenses without compromising my business operations or personal financial security. More challenging was the emotional preparation required for returning to Portland and facing family members who had not seen me since the early months following Michael's disappearance. My parents had never fully accepted my decision to relocate to Seattle and start over, rather than remaining in Portland where they could provide support and guidance during my recovery process. Their disapproval had been expressed through passive-aggressive comments about my selfishness and unrealistic expectations about marriage and commitment. They had maintained that Michael's departure was likely temporary, and that my unwillingness to wait patiently for his return demonstrated character flaws that had probably contributed to our marital problems. The therapeutic work I had undertaken during my recovery process had helped me understand that my parents' response to Michael's disappearance reflected their own fears about relationship stability and their investment in maintaining the appearance of family harmony, rather than addressing underlying dysfunction. Their criticism of my decision to rebuild independently had more to do with their discomfort with my transformation than with genuine concern about my well-being or prospects for future happiness. Preparing for Vanessa's wedding required me to confront the possibility that family members would use the occasion to revisit old arguments about my response to Michael's disappearance and my subsequent choices about geographic relocation and limited family contact. I spent considerable time developing strategies for deflecting inappropriate questions while maintaining civility and avoiding conflicts that would overshadow Vanessa's celebration or create lasting damage to family relationships. The motivation for attending Vanessa's wedding, despite these concerns, derived from my commitment to supporting her happiness and my recognition that family relationships, however complicated, deserved preservation when possible. My personal growth during the previous 3 years had given me confidence that I could navigate difficult family dynamics without compromising my emotional stability or professional obligations. I had learned to establish boundaries while maintaining compassion, and I believed these skills would enable me to participate meaningfully in Vanessa's celebration. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with careful preparation that reflected both my professional attention to detail and my emotional commitment to presenting myself as the successful, independent person I had become. I selected attire that was appropriate for the formal cathedral ceremony while reflecting my personal style and professional success. I arranged for coverage of my business responsibilities during my absence and confirmed travel arrangements that would minimize stress while maximizing my ability to participate fully in wedding activities. Communication with Vanessa during the pre-wedding period had been cordial but limited, consisting primarily of logistical discussions about travel arrangements and ceremony details. She had seemed unusually distracted during our telephone conversations, which I attributed to normal pre-wedding stress and the complexity of organizing such an elaborate celebration. Her reluctance to discuss David in detail struck me as slightly unusual given her historical tendency to overshare romantic information, but I assumed this discretion reflected her desire to avoid family commentary about her relationship choices. The flight from Seattle to Portland on the morning of June 14th provided time for reflection about the changes in my life since I had last visited my hometown for any extended period. The woman boarding that airplane bore little resemblance to the dependent, uncertain person who had fled Portland 3 years earlier, in a state of emotional devastation and financial panic. I had developed professional expertise, financial independence, and emotional resilience that would have been unimaginable during the darkest months following Michael's disappearance. Arriving in Portland triggered a complex mixture of nostalgia and anxiety, as familiar landmarks reminded me of both positive memories from my earlier life and painful associations with the period surrounding my marriage's collapse. The city had continued developing during my absence, with new buildings and businesses reflecting economic growth and demographic changes that had occurred while I was focused on rebuilding my life in Seattle. These physical changes somehow made returning feel less threatening, as if the Portland I was visiting was sufficiently different from the one I had left to allow for a fresh perspective on old experiences. The hotel I had selected for my stay was located downtown within walking distance of St. Catherine's Cathedral, but far enough from my childhood neighborhood to avoid accidental encounters with former acquaintances who might create awkward social situations. The accommodations were comfortable but not extravagant, reflecting my commitment to financial responsibility while ensuring adequate comfort during what I anticipated would be an emotionally challenging weekend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rehearsal dinner on Friday evening provided my first opportunity to interact with family members in a social setting since relocating to Seattle. The initial greetings were cordial but somewhat formal, with relatives commenting on my appearance and asking polite questions about my life in Seattle, while avoiding direct discussion of the circumstances that had prompted my departure from Portland. I noticed that several family members seemed uncomfortable with my obvious prosperity and confidence, as if my success somehow challenged their expectations about how abandoned wives should behave. Vanessa appeared radiant during the rehearsal activities, though I observed moments of tension when she thought no one was watching that suggested possible anxiety about aspects of the wedding beyond typical pre-ceremony nervousness. Her interactions with David were affectionate but somehow performative, lacking the natural intimacy I would have expected from couples preparing to make lifetime commitments to each other. David himself seemed pleasant but somewhat reserved, participating in conversations without revealing much about his personality or background. The evening concluded with my return to the hotel and careful preparation for the following day's ceremony. I had selected my attire and accessories with considerable attention to presenting myself as successful and confident, while respecting the formality of the cathedral setting and the significance of the occasion for Vanessa. As I prepared for sleep, I felt cautiously optimistic that the weekend would proceed smoothly and that my presence would contribute positively to Vanessa's celebration without creating the family drama I had feared might develop. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and warm, providing perfect weather for both the cathedral ceremony and the outdoor reception activities planned for later in the day. I took particular care with my preparation, understanding that my appearance would be scrutinized by family members and wedding guests who had not seen me since the difficult period following Michael's disappearance. The woman looking back at me from the hotel mirror bore little resemblance to the broken person who had left Portland 3 years earlier, and I felt genuinely proud of the transformation I had achieved through determination and hard work. The drive to St. Catherine's Cathedral provided final moments for mental preparation and reflection about the significance of this return to Portland and my family. I had survived the most challenging period of my life and emerged stronger, more capable and more self-aware than I had ever been previously. Whatever awkwardness or family tension might arise during the wedding celebration, I possessed the emotional tools and practical confidence necessary to navigate these challenges while maintaining my dignity and supporting Vanessa's happiness. As I approached the cathedral, I could see wedding guests arriving in their formal attire, and I felt a surge of anticipation about participating in this celebration of love and commitment. Despite the complications in my relationship with Vanessa and my concerns about family dynamics, I genuinely wanted her to experience the happiness and security that had eluded me in my own marriage. The optimism I felt as I walked toward the cathedral entrance would soon be shattered by a discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about my sister, my marriage, and my own future. The stage was set for revelations that would test every aspect of the strength and wisdom I had developed during my 3 years of independent rebuilding. The woman entering St. Catherine's Cathedral that morning was prepared for family awkwardness and emotional challenges. But nothing could have prepared me for the shock of discovering that the man my sister was about to marry was the husband who had abandoned me without explanation 3 years earlier, now living under a completely different identity and apparently having no intention of acknowledging our shared history or his obligations to me. The interior of St. Catherine's Cathedral possessed the timeless grandeur that made it Portland's most sought-after wedding venue. Soaring Gothic arches stretched toward heaven while stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across polished marble floors that had witnessed countless ceremonies marking life's most significant transitions. The morning sunlight streaming through the ornate windows created an atmosphere of sacred beauty that seemed to promise divine blessing upon whatever union would be celebrated within these hallowed walls. I selected a seat in the fourth row on the bride's side, positioning myself where I could observe the ceremony clearly while avoiding the front rows reserved for immediate family members whose presence might complicate my emotional experience of the event. The wooden pew beneath me had been carved from old-growth timber decades earlier, its surface worn smooth by generations of wedding guests who had gathered to witness promises of eternal devotion and commitment. Fellow wedding guests continued arriving in small groups, their formal attire and animated conversations creating the festive atmosphere that accompanies celebrations of love and new beginnings. I recognized several faces from childhood family gatherings, though many relatives appeared older and changed by the passage of time since our last encounters. Their polite nods and brief smiles suggested they recognized me as well, though the obvious prosperity reflected in my professional attire seemed to surprise those who remembered the broken woman who had departed Portland 3 years earlier. The cathedral's acoustics amplified every whispered conversation and rustling movement, creating a symphony of anticipation that built steadily as the ceremony's scheduled start time approached. Wedding guests spoke in hushed tones about Vanessa's radiant beauty during the previous evening's rehearsal dinner and speculated about the romantic details of her relationship with David Thompson, whose background remained mysteriously vague despite numerous indirect inquiries from curious family members. My parents occupied the front row with the dignity and pride appropriate for the bride's family, though I detected subtle signs of tension in their rigid posture and forced smiles that suggested underlying concerns about aspects of this wedding beyond typical parental anxiety about their daughter's happiness. My mother's occasional glances toward the cathedral entrance indicated she was monitoring arrivals with unusual intensity, as if expecting someone whose presence might create complications for the celebration. The wedding program distributed by ushers provided basic information about the ceremony's structure and participants, though the biographical details about David Thompson were remarkably brief and generic. The description identified him as a successful businessman originally from the East Coast, who had relocated to Portland 2 years earlier for career opportunities. His educational background and professional history were mentioned only in vague terms that provided no specific information about his qualifications or achievements. Musical prelude began as the cathedral's magnificent pipe organ filled the sacred space with classical compositions that had accompanied wedding ceremonies for centuries. The organist's skilled performance created an atmosphere of reverence and celebration that elevated the gathering beyond mere social occasion into something approaching religious experience. The familiar melodies stirred emotions and memories about the universal human desire for lasting love and committed partnership. Wedding party members began their processional entrance with the careful timing and choreographed precision that had been rehearsed the previous evening. Bridesmaids moved gracefully down the center aisle, wearing elegant dresses in soft lavender that complemented the cathedral's ornate interior design while creating visual harmony that enhanced the ceremony's aesthetic appeal. Their practiced smiles and measured steps reflected the careful preparation that had preceded this moment. Groomsmen followed in traditional black tuxedos that conveyed the formality and significance of the occasion, while demonstrating respect for the sacred setting and the solemnity of the vows that would be exchanged. Their coordinated movements and serious expressions indicated their understanding of their role as witnesses to promises that were intended to last beyond the temporary emotions of romantic infatuation into the permanent commitment of marriage. The moment approached when the groom would take his position at the altar and turn to await his bride's entrance. Wedding guests rose collectively in preparation for the traditional bridal processional that would mark the ceremony's culmination and the formal beginning of David and Vanessa's married life together. The anticipation in the cathedral reached its peak as hundreds of people prepared to witness the exchange of vows that would legally and spiritually unite two people in permanent partnership. David Thompson emerged from the side entrance typically used by wedding officiants and groom's parties, moving with confident strides toward his position beside the altar, where he would await Vanessa's arrival. His appearance was impeccable, from his perfectly fitted tuxedo to his carefully styled hair to his practiced smile that conveyed appropriate nervousness mixed with joy about the commitment he was preparing to make. The moment David turned to face the congregation while waiting for his bride's entrance, my carefully constructed world collapsed with the devastating completeness of a controlled demolition. The face looking back toward the cathedral entrance with anticipation and happiness belonged unmistakably to Michael Rodriguez, my husband who had vanished without explanation 3 years earlier, leaving me to rebuild my life from the financial and emotional wreckage of his abandonment. The recognition hit me with physical force that left me struggling to breathe normally, while maintaining the composed appearance necessary to avoid creating a scene during my sister's wedding ceremony. Every detail of David Thompson's appearance confirmed what my initial glance had revealed beyond any possibility of mistake or wishful thinking. The slight scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. The distinctive way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right due to an old sports injury. The unconscious habit of running his fingers through his hair when he felt nervous or excited. Michael Rodriguez had somehow transformed into David Thompson, complete with new name, new background, and apparently new identity, that enabled him to court and marry my younger sister without anyone in my family recognizing him as the man who had abandoned me 3 years earlier. The elaborate deception required to accomplish this transformation suggested planning and calculation that made his original disappearance appear far more sinister than the spontaneous crisis of confidence I had assumed had motivated his departure. The psychological impact of seeing Michael standing at the altar preparing to marry Vanessa created a cascade of emotions that threatened to overwhelm my ability to process what was happening around me. Shock at his presence mixed with rage about his deception, grief about our failed marriage, and horrified realization that my sister was either complicit in an elaborate betrayal or an innocent victim of Michael's manipulation and lies. The implications of Michael's presence at this wedding extended far beyond personal betrayal to encompass legal and financial consequences that could affect both Vanessa's future and my own ongoing recovery from his abandonment. If Michael was legally still married to me, his attempted marriage to Vanessa would constitute bigamy that could result in criminal charges and legal complications for everyone involved. The financial obligations he had abandoned when he disappeared, including joint debts and shared assets, remained unresolved and could affect Vanessa's financial security if she became legally entangled with his deceptions. My mind raced through possible explanations for how this situation had developed without my knowledge or anyone in my family recognizing the man Vanessa intended to marry. The most charitable interpretation suggested that Michael had suffered some form of psychological breakdown that created genuine memory loss about his previous identity and marriage. However, the elaborate nature of his identity transformation and his successful integration into Portland's social and business communities suggested deliberate deception rather than psychological dysfunction. The wedding processional continued around me while I struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the deception I was witnessing. Other wedding guests remained focused on the ceremony's traditional elements, unaware that the groom's identity represented a fraud that threatened the legal validity of the marriage they were assembled to witness. The sacred atmosphere of the cathedral contrasted sharply with the criminal activity being perpetrated within its walls by someone I had once trusted with my entire future. Vanessa's entrance at the cathedral's rear doors marked the ceremony's climactic moment, though her radiant smile and obvious happiness created additional anguish as I recognized that her joy was based on fundamental deceptions about the character and background of the man she believed she was marrying. Her wedding dress was everything she had dreamed of since childhood, flowing elegantly as she walked down the aisle toward what she assumed was the beginning of her happily ever after. The decision I faced in that moment would define not only my own character, but also the future happiness and security of everyone in that cathedral. I could remain silent and allow the ceremony to proceed, protecting Vanessa's immediate happiness while enabling Michael to continue his deception and potentially harm additional victims. Alternatively, I could expose the truth immediately, destroying Vanessa's wedding day but potentially preventing greater harm and holding Michael accountable for his actions. The weight of this decision pressed down on me with crushing intensity as I watched Vanessa approach the altar, where Michael waited with practiced expressions of love and devotion that I now recognized as performance rather than authentic emotion. Every step she took toward him represented another moment of deception that would be harder to undo once the ceremony was completed and legal documents were signed. Professional success and personal growth during the previous 3 years had given me confidence in my judgment and the courage to make difficult decisions when circumstances demanded action. The woman sitting in that cathedral pew possessed resources and capabilities that the abandoned wife of 3 years earlier had lacked. I had rebuilt my life through honest work and ethical behavior, and I understood that maintaining my integrity required taking action when confronted with fraud and deception. The therapeutic work I had undertaken during my recovery had emphasized the importance of speaking truth even when doing so created uncomfortable consequences for others. My counselor had repeatedly stressed that protecting people from the natural results of their actions often prevented them from learning necessary lessons and making positive changes in their behavior. Enabling deception by remaining silent would harm everyone involved, including Michael himself. The moment for decision arrived as Vanessa reached the altar and prepared to join hands with the man she knew as David Thompson, but who was actually my missing husband, Michael Rodriguez. The cathedral fell silent except for the rustle of fabric and the soft breathing of hundreds of wedding guests who expected to witness a traditional exchange of vows and rings that would legally unite two people in marriage. I understood with crystalline clarity that the next few minutes would determine whether I had truly developed the courage and integrity necessary to stand up for truth regardless of personal cost or social pressure. The ease of remaining silent and avoiding confrontation appealed to the conflict-avoidant tendencies that had characterized my behavior during my marriage to Michael. However, the strength I had developed through 3 years of independent rebuilding demanded that I protect my sister from the deception that was about to trap her in a fraudulent marriage. The wedding officiant began speaking the traditional words that opened marriage ceremonies, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cathedral as he welcomed the gathered community to witness the union of David and Vanessa. The familiar phrases about love, commitment, and sacred promises created bitter irony, given the fundamental dishonesty underlying everything about the groom's identity and intentions. As the officiant continued with the ceremony's opening remarks, I made my decision with the clarity and determination that had enabled me to rebuild my life from nothing. I would not allow my sister to be victimized by the same man who had already caused me years of pain and financial hardship. The truth needed to be spoken regardless of the immediate consequences for family relationships or social embarrassment. The woman who had been abandoned and left financially devastated 3 years earlier might have remained silent to avoid conflict and protect others from discomfort. However, the successful entrepreneur and confident individual I had become possessed both the moral courage and practical resources necessary to confront deception and protect innocent people from fraud. Michael's attempt to bigamously marry my sister while maintaining his abandonment of our legal marriage represented criminal behavior that demanded immediate exposure and accountability. My hands gripped the wooden pew as I prepared to stand and speak the words that would shatter the illusion of this wedding ceremony, while revealing truths that everyone in the cathedral needed to understand about the man preparing to make false promises to my sister. The weight of 3 years of rebuilding, growth, and self-discovery condensed into a single moment of absolute clarity as I rose from the wooden pew with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to command respect through authentic strength rather than desperate pleading. The rustling of my formal attire created a whisper of sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the cathedral's expectant silence, though most wedding guests remained focused on the altar where the officiant continued his opening remarks about the sacred nature of marriage vows. My movement upward felt both inevitable and surreal, as if I were watching myself from a distance while simultaneously experiencing the profound physical sensations of adrenaline coursing through my system. The 3 years of therapy, professional development, and personal transformation had prepared me for many challenging situations, but nothing had specifically prepared me for the moment when I would need to expose my missing husband's bigamous deception during my sister's wedding ceremony. The cathedral's acoustics amplified every sound as I stepped into the center aisle, my heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision that reflected the disciplined approach I had developed toward addressing complex problems in both business and personal contexts. The sound of my footsteps created a subtle rhythm that gradually drew attention from wedding guests who turned in their seats to observe the unexpected interruption of the ceremony's traditional flow. The officiant paused in his remarks as he noticed the disturbance, his experienced eye recognizing that something unusual was developing that might require his intervention or accommodation. His decades of conducting wedding ceremonies had undoubtedly exposed him to various forms of family drama and unexpected developments, though the situation unfolding before him likely exceeded his previous experience with wedding day complications. Vanessa's expression shifted from radiant joy to confused concern as she noticed the growing disturbance behind her, though she had not yet turned completely around to identify the source of the interruption. Her wedding dress rustled softly as she moved slightly toward the sound, her natural instinct to understand what was happening overriding the trained behavior from wedding rehearsals that emphasized maintaining forward focus during the ceremony. Michael's face registered initial annoyance at the disruption of what he had assumed would be a smooth ceremony marking his successful transformation from abandoned husband to beloved brother-in-law. However, as his gaze focused on my approaching figure, his expression shifted through rapid stages of recognition, shock, and calculating assessment of the threat my presence represented to his carefully constructed deception. The wedding guests' murmurs of confusion and curiosity created a growing buzz of conversation that threatened to overwhelm the cathedral's sacred atmosphere, though most attendees remained uncertain about whether they were witnessing a planned ceremony element or a genuine emergency requiring intervention. Their faces reflected the awkward uncertainty of people caught between politeness and curiosity about dramatic events unfolding before them. My parents' faces displayed horror and embarrassment that their elder daughter was creating a scene during their younger daughter's wedding ceremony, though I could detect underneath their social mortification a growing recognition that my actions might be motivated by information they did not possess. My mother's hand moved toward my father's arm in the unconscious gesture she had always used when family crises required unified response. The decision to speak required summoning every element of courage, professional competence, and moral clarity I had developed during my years of recovery and rebuilding. The woman who had been abandoned 3 years earlier might have remained silent to avoid confrontation and protect others from discomfort. However, the successful entrepreneur and confident individual I had become possessed both the moral obligation and practical capability to expose deception that threatened innocent people. "Stop this ceremony," I declared with the clear, authoritative voice I had developed through years of leading client presentations and managing business crises. The words carried throughout the cathedral with unmistakable clarity, leaving no doubt about their meaning or my determination to be heard, regardless of social conventions or family expectations about appropriate wedding behavior. The cathedral fell into absolute silence as hundreds of people processed the unprecedented interruption of what had been expected to be a traditional wedding ceremony. The weight of their collective attention focused on me with an intensity that might have been overwhelming if I had not spent 3 years developing the confidence necessary to stand alone when circumstances demanded individual action rather than group consensus. "The man standing at this altar is not David Thompson," I continued with the steady delivery of someone presenting crucial evidence in a business meeting where accuracy and credibility would determine important outcomes. "His real name is Michael Rodriguez, and he is my husband who abandoned me 3 years ago without explanation or legal divorce proceedings." The gasps and exclamations from wedding guests created a wave of sound that rolled through the cathedral as people struggled to comprehend the implications of my revelation. Some attendees rose from their seats to better observe the unfolding drama, while others remained seated but leaned forward with the fascination that accompanies unexpected revelations of hidden truths during supposedly routine social events. Vanessa turned fully around to face me, her wedding dress swirling dramatically as she moved with sudden urgency to confront this challenge to her happiness and security. Her face displayed a complex mixture of emotions including confusion, anger, and dawning horror, as she began to understand that her wedding day was dissolving into family scandal and legal complications she had never imagined possible. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" Vanessa demanded with the sharp tone she had always used when challenging my authority or questioning my judgment about family matters. Her voice carried clearly throughout the cathedral, though the tremor underlying her angry words suggested that she was beginning to recognize the potential validity of my accusations despite their apparent impossibility. Michael's response revealed the calculating intelligence that had enabled him to maintain his deception for 2 years, while courting my sister and integrating himself into Portland's social and business community. Rather than immediate denial or emotional outburst, he maintained his composure while rapidly assessing options for managing this crisis to minimize damage to his carefully constructed false identity. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Michael replied with practiced calm that demonstrated his skill at maintaining deception under pressure. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to using charm and misdirection to avoid accountability for dishonest behavior. "I don't know who this woman thinks I am, but my name is David Thompson and I've never been married before." The audacity of his continued deception in the face of direct confrontation triggered a surge of righteous anger that crystallized my determination to expose every aspect of his fraud, regardless of the immediate consequences for family relationships or social harmony. The 3 years of wondering why my marriage had failed, and whether I had contributed to his departure, suddenly resolved into clear understanding that I had been victimized by a manipulative individual whose problems extended far beyond our relationship. "You have a scar above your left eyebrow from falling off your bicycle when you were 8 years old," I stated with the precision of someone presenting documented evidence in a legal proceeding. "You dislocated your left shoulder playing football in high school, which is why you still hold it slightly higher than your right. You're allergic to shellfish, and you have a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on your lower back." The specific details of Michael's physical characteristics and personal history created visible impact among wedding guests, who recognized that such intimate knowledge could not be fabricated or mistaken. Several family members who had interacted with David Thompson during the engagement period began nodding with recognition as they recalled observing some of the details I had mentioned during previous social gatherings. Vanessa's expression shifted from angry denial toward horrified realization as she processed the implications of my detailed knowledge about physical characteristics that only a wife would know. Her face grew pale beneath her carefully applied wedding makeup as she began to understand that her perfect fairy tale romance was collapsing into a nightmare of deception and betrayal. Michael's composure began to crack under the weight of evidence that could not be explained away through charm or misdirection. His calculating assessment of damage control options was complicated by the presence of hundreds of witnesses whose memory of this confrontation would make continued deception impossible, regardless of how he chose to respond to my accusations. "Even if what you're saying were true, which it isn't," Michael attempted with diminishing confidence, "you said yourself that your husband abandoned you 3 years ago. That would constitute abandonment grounds for divorce, which would make me legally free to marry Vanessa regardless of any previous relationship." The legal sophistication of his response revealed that Michael had anticipated the possibility of discovery and had researched potential defenses for his bigamous behavior. However, his knowledge of abandonment law also demonstrated premeditation in his deception rather than impulsive response to unexpected circumstances, which strengthened rather than weakened the case for his criminal liability. "Abandonment does not automatically dissolve a marriage," I replied with the authority of someone who had spent considerable time researching legal options during the early months following his disappearance. "Divorce requires legal proceedings that establish grounds and provide proper notification to both parties. No such proceedings were ever initiated, which means our marriage remains legally valid and your attempted marriage to my sister constitutes bigamy." The word bigamy created another wave of gasps and exclamations throughout the cathedral as wedding guests recognized the criminal implications of the situation they were witnessing. Several attendees began reaching for their mobile phones, though whether to document the confrontation or to seek advice about appropriate responses remained unclear. The wedding officiant stepped forward with the diplomatic skill developed through years of managing family conflicts during emotionally charged ceremonies. His intervention reflected both concern for the legal validity of proceedings under his authority and recognition that the situation had evolved beyond simple family disagreement into potential criminal behavior requiring careful handling. "Given the serious nature of these allegations," the officiant announced with formal gravity, "I cannot in good conscience proceed with this ceremony until these matters are resolved through appropriate legal channels. The marriage of any person who is already legally married to someone else would be invalid regardless of the circumstances surrounding the previous union." His statement effectively halted the wedding ceremony while validating my intervention as necessary protection for Vanessa rather than malicious interference with her happiness. The official nature of his declaration also created legal documentation of the bigamy allegation that would complicate any future attempts by Michael to deny or minimize his deceptive behavior. Vanessa's composure finally shattered as the full implications of the situation penetrated her shocked consciousness. The wedding dress that had represented her dreams of fairy tale romance suddenly became a symbol of public humiliation and betrayal by the man she had trusted with her future happiness and financial security. "Is it true?" she whispered toward Michael with the desperate hope of someone seeking reassurance that their worst fears were unfounded. Her voice barely carried beyond the altar area, though the cathedral's silence amplified her question sufficiently for nearby wedding guests to hear her plea for honesty from the man she had planned to marry. Michael's response to Vanessa's direct question revealed the moment when his elaborate deception finally collapsed under the weight of evidence and witness testimony that could not be overcome through continued lies. His shoulders sagged slightly as he recognized that maintaining his false identity was no longer possible given the specificity of my knowledge and the public nature of the confrontation. "Vanessa, I can explain everything," he began with the tone of someone attempting to minimize the significance of devastating revelations. His words carried the familiar pattern of manipulation I remembered from our marriage, when he would acknowledge wrongdoing while simultaneously attempting to justify his behavior and shift responsibility to external circumstances. The admission implicit in his offer to explain everything confirmed my accusations while revealing to everyone present that David Thompson had indeed been a fabricated identity designed to conceal his previous marriage and the circumstances of his abandonment. The wedding guests' shocked murmurs reflected their recognition that they had been witnesses to an elaborate fraud rather than a legitimate celebration of love and commitment. My sister's world had been shattered by the revelation that her perfect romance was built on fundamental deceptions about her fiancé's identity and character. However, my intervention had protected her from the greater harm that would have resulted from completing a bigamous marriage that would have created legal complications and emotional trauma extending far beyond the immediate embarrassment of a canceled wedding ceremony. The strength I had developed through 3 years of rebuilding my life independently had enabled me to speak truth when silence would have been easier but ultimately more harmful to everyone involved. The woman standing in that cathedral possessed the moral courage and practical capability necessary to protect innocent people from fraud, even when doing so required confronting powerful social pressures and family expectations about appropriate behavior. The silence that followed Michael's implicit admission created a vacuum of sound that seemed to draw all energy from the cathedral's sacred space. Wedding guests remained frozen in their positions, processing the magnitude of deception that had been exposed before their eyes, while struggling to comprehend how such elaborate fraud had been perpetrated within their community, without detection or suspicion from those closest to the perpetrator. Vanessa stood motionless at the altar, her wedding dress now representing the destruction of dreams rather than their fulfillment. The carefully planned celebration that was intended to mark the beginning of her married life had transformed into a public revelation of betrayal that would require years to process and overcome. Her face reflected the complex emotional journey from joy through confusion to dawning comprehension of the extent to which she had been manipulated and deceived. The wedding officiant maintained his position between the altar and the congregation, his clerical authority providing stability during a crisis that threatened to escalate beyond manageable proportions. His experience with family conflicts during ceremonial occasions enabled him to recognize the need for careful management of the situation to prevent additional harm, while ensuring that appropriate legal and ethical standards were maintained throughout the resolution process. My parents rose from their front row seats with expressions that reflected their struggle to balance embarrassment about the public spectacle, with growing recognition that my intervention had protected Vanessa from consequences that would have extended far beyond social humiliation. Their faces displayed the complex emotions of parents confronting the reality that their assumptions about family members had been fundamentally incorrect and potentially dangerous. The first person to break the cathedral's shocked silence was my Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing family crises with practical efficiency. Her question addressed the immediate concern that occupied the minds of everyone present, while establishing framework for constructive response to the devastating revelations. "What exactly do we need to do now to protect Vanessa and resolve this situation legally?" she asked with the directness that had made her successful in her career as a family law attorney. Her professional expertise provided crucial guidance during a crisis where emotional reactions threatened to overwhelm rational decision-making and appropriate legal procedures. Michael's response to Aunt Margaret's question revealed his recognition that continued deception was impossible, given the evidence I had presented and the witnesses who had observed his implicit admission of guilt. However, his attempt to control the narrative and minimize his responsibility demonstrated the manipulative behavior patterns that had characterized his approach to our marriage and subsequent abandonment. "This is a private family matter that should be discussed away from this public setting," he stated with diminishing confidence, gesturing toward the hundreds of wedding guests whose presence complicated his ability to manage the crisis through private negotiation and emotional manipulation. His suggestion reflected awareness that public scrutiny would prevent the gaslighting and misdirection tactics he had successfully employed in private relationships. The inadequacy of Michael's response triggered protective instincts among family members who recognized that Vanessa required advocacy and support during her moment of vulnerability. Several relatives began moving toward the altar area with expressions of concern and determination to ensure that she received appropriate assistance during the crisis that threatened to overwhelm her emotional and practical capacity for self-protection. Uncle Robert, my mother's brother who had served as a police detective before retirement, stepped into the center aisle with the measured authority of someone accustomed to managing criminal investigations and protecting vulnerable individuals from further harm. His intervention provided crucial law enforcement perspective on the legal implications of Michael's deceptive behavior and the procedures required to address potential criminal violations. "Bigamy is a felony in this state," he announced with professional gravity that emphasized the serious legal consequences Michael faced as a result of his attempted fraudulent marriage. "The appropriate authorities need to be notified immediately to investigate this situation and determine what charges may be warranted based on the evidence and testimony available." His statement created additional waves of shocked conversation among wedding guests who had not previously considered the criminal implications of the situation they were witnessing. The realization that they had been assembled to witness a felony rather than a legitimate wedding ceremony transformed their understanding of the events unfolding before them and their potential roles as witnesses in subsequent legal proceedings. Vanessa's emotional composure finally collapsed completely as the full implications of her situation penetrated her consciousness. The fairy tale romance she had believed was leading toward lifelong happiness had been revealed as an elaborate fraud perpetrated by a man who was already married to her sister and had abandoned his previous wife without legal resolution or explanation. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded of Michael with the anguished voice of someone confronting the destruction of everything she had believed about her future security and happiness. Her question carried the weight of betrayed trust and shattered dreams that would require extensive healing and recovery to overcome. Michael's response revealed the depth of his narcissistic personality and his inability to accept responsibility for the harm his deceptive behavior had caused to multiple victims. Rather than expressing remorse or acknowledging the magnitude of his betrayal, he attempted to justify his actions through deflection and blame shifting that demonstrated his fundamental lack of empathy or moral accountability. "My marriage to Rebecca was already over when I left," he claimed, with the defensive tone of someone attempting to rationalize inexcusable behavior through technical distinctions that ignored the emotional and legal reality of his obligations. "I was planning to file for divorce before proposing to Vanessa, but the paperwork got delayed because of complicated financial issues." The transparent falseness of his explanation was immediately apparent to everyone present, particularly given his earlier use of a completely fabricated identity rather than his legal name. His claim about intending to pursue divorce proceedings was contradicted by his elaborate efforts to conceal his previous marriage rather than resolve it through appropriate legal channels. My response to Michael's attempted justification drew upon the strength and clarity I had developed through 3 years of therapy and personal growth work that had enabled me to recognize manipulation tactics and respond with factual accuracy rather than emotional reactivity. The woman who had been abandoned 3 years earlier might have been confused by his gaslighting attempts, but the successful entrepreneur I had become possessed the analytical skills necessary to expose his deceptions systematically. "You never contacted me about divorce proceedings," I stated with the calm authority of someone presenting documented evidence in a business meeting. "You disappeared without explanation and created a completely new identity to avoid any legal or financial responsibilities associated with our marriage. Your actions constitute abandonment, identity fraud, and attempted bigamy." The specificity of my response created additional credibility for my accusations, while demonstrating that I possessed both the knowledge and documentation necessary to support legal action against Michael for his criminal behavior. Wedding guests recognized that my intervention was based on factual evidence rather than emotional vindictiveness or family jealousy about Vanessa's apparent happiness. The practical implications of the situation began to emerge as family members started discussing immediate steps necessary to protect Vanessa's interests and ensure appropriate legal procedures were followed. The wedding reception at Riverside Manor needed to be canceled, guests required notification about the ceremony's termination, and legal consultation was necessary to determine Vanessa's options for addressing any financial entanglements with Michael. My mother approached me with an expression that reflected her recognition that my intervention, however disruptive to the planned celebration, had protected Vanessa from consequences that would have been far more devastating than the current embarrassment and disappointment. Her acknowledgement represented a significant shift in our relationship dynamic and validation of the strength I had developed through independent rebuilding. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology," she said with the humility of someone recognizing that their previous judgments had been fundamentally incorrect. "We should have supported you better when Michael disappeared, and we should have trusted your strength to rebuild your life successfully. You saved Vanessa from making a terrible mistake." Her words provided emotional validation that I had not realized I needed until that moment. The family relationships that had been strained by my decision to relocate and rebuild independently were beginning to heal through shared recognition that my personal growth had enabled me to protect others from harm when circumstances required difficult action. The wedding guests began departing from the cathedral in small groups, their conversations reflecting mixture of shock, sympathy, and fascination with the dramatic events they had witnessed. Several family friends approached me to express admiration for my courage in speaking truth, despite the social pressure to remain silent and avoid disrupting the celebration. The logistics of managing the canceled wedding created immediate practical challenges that required coordinated family response. The reception venue needed notification, catering arrangements required cancellation, and wedding gifts would need to be returned to avoid creating awkward obligations between Vanessa and guests who had attended expecting to celebrate a legitimate marriage ceremony. Vanessa required immediate emotional support and practical assistance to process the trauma of discovering that her engagement had been based on fundamental deceptions about her fiancé's identity and availability for marriage. The fairy tale romance she had believed was leading towards security and happiness had collapsed into a nightmare of betrayal that would require professional counseling and family support to overcome. Michael's response to the complete exposure of his deception revealed his recognition that continued presence in Portland would likely result in criminal prosecution and civil liability for the financial and emotional harm he had caused. His calculating assessment of damage control options focused on immediate escape rather than accountability or attempts to repair the relationships he had destroyed through his fraudulent behavior. "I need to leave now to handle some urgent business matters," he announced with transparent desperation while moving toward the cathedral's side exit typically reserved for wedding party members. His attempted departure demonstrated his awareness that remaining to face consequences would result in legal complications that would prevent his continued avoidance of responsibility. Uncle Robert's law enforcement background enabled him to recognize Michael's flight risk and take appropriate action to prevent his escape before proper legal procedures could be initiated. His intervention reflected understanding that allowing Michael to disappear again would leave both Vanessa and me without recourse for addressing the harm his deceptive behavior had caused. "You're not going anywhere until the police arrive and can properly document this situation," Uncle Robert stated with the authority of someone accustomed to detaining suspects during criminal investigations. His physical positioning near the exit and confident demeanor discouraged Michael from attempting to force his departure despite his obvious desperation to avoid accountability. The cathedral's atmosphere shifted from shocked silence to organized crisis management as family members began implementing practical solutions to address the immediate consequences of the canceled wedding, while ensuring that appropriate legal procedures were followed to protect everyone's interests and hold Michael accountable for his criminal behavior. The transformation I had undergone during 3 years of independent rebuilding had culminated in this moment of moral courage that protected my sister from the same abandonment and betrayal I had experienced. The strength I had developed through surviving my own crisis enabled me to act decisively when circumstances required someone to speak truth, regardless of personal cost or social pressure. The woman who had stood up in that cathedral possessed capabilities and confidence that would have been unimaginable to the broken person who had fled Portland 3 years earlier. My journey from victim to protector demonstrated how surviving adversity can develop the resilience and wisdom necessary to prevent others from experiencing similar harm when opportunities for intervention arise. The Portland Police Department's response to Uncle Robert's emergency call demonstrated the serious nature of the criminal allegations that had emerged from what should have been a joyous family celebration. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at St. Catherine's Cathedral within 20 minutes of notification, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers whose presence transformed the sacred space into an active crime scene requiring careful documentation and witness management. Detective Chen's professional demeanor and systematic approach to gathering information provided reassurance during a crisis that threatened to overwhelm the emotional capacity of everyone involved. Her 15 years of experience investigating fraud and identity theft cases enabled her to recognize immediately that Michael's deceptive behavior represented a complex criminal enterprise rather than a simple case of relationship infidelity or family dispute. The detective's initial assessment involved separating the principal parties to prevent coordination of testimony, while ensuring that crucial evidence was preserved before Michael could attempt to destroy documentation or flee the jurisdiction. Her understanding of criminal psychology and investigation procedures provided framework for addressing the multifaceted legal violations that had been exposed through my intervention at the wedding ceremony. Michael's behavior during the initial police questioning revealed the sophisticated nature of his deceptive capabilities and his extensive experience avoiding accountability for fraudulent activities. Rather than expressing remorse or cooperating with the investigation, he immediately requested legal representation while maintaining his fabricated identity and denying any previous relationship with me, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His calculated response to police questioning suggested that his identity fraud and bigamous behavior were components of a larger pattern of criminal activity that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of his relationship with Vanessa. Detective Chen's experienced assessment recognized indicators that Michael Rodriguez, operating under the alias David Thompson, might be connected to additional fraud cases that had not yet been linked to his activities. The documentation I provided to Detective Chen included copies of our marriage certificate, joint bank account records, mortgage documents, and photographs spanning our 3-year relationship that conclusively established Michael's true identity and our legal marriage status. The comprehensive nature of this evidence reflected the systematic approach I had developed during my business career and my recognition that thorough preparation would be essential for achieving justice. Vanessa's emotional condition required immediate attention from family members and professional counselors, who specialized in helping victims of fraud and emotional manipulation recover from the trauma of discovering that their romantic relationships were based on fundamental deceptions. The collapse of her fairy tale engagement had created psychological wounds that would require extensive healing and support to overcome. The crisis counselor who responded to Detective Chen's request for victim services assistance explained that romantic fraud cases often created more severe psychological trauma than other forms of financial crime because they violated fundamental assumptions about trust, love, and personal safety. Vanessa's recovery would require professional guidance to process the complex emotions associated with betrayal by someone she had believed was committed to her welfare and happiness. The investigation into Michael's background revealed the extensive planning and resources that had been required to establish his false identity as David Thompson. Detective Chen's preliminary research uncovered evidence of fraudulent Social Security numbers, fabricated employment history, and falsified educational credentials that suggested criminal expertise developed through years of practice rather than amateur deception motivated by romantic desperation. The financial implications of Michael's fraud extended far beyond the immediate impact on Vanessa's wedding expenses to encompass potential liability for debts and obligations he had accumulated while operating under his false identity. Detective Chen's investigation would need to determine whether businesses, landlords, or other individuals had been victimized by his deceptive practices during the 2 years he had been establishing himself in Portland's business community. My cooperation with the police investigation required providing detailed testimony about our marriage, Michael's disappearance, and the circumstances of my recognition at the wedding ceremony. The systematic documentation of these events challenged me to recall painful memories I had worked diligently to process and overcome during my recovery period, though I recognized that justice for both Vanessa and myself required complete transparency about Michael's behavior patterns. The strength I had developed through 3 years of independent rebuilding enabled me to provide clear, factual testimony without becoming overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of revisiting the abandonment and betrayal that had nearly destroyed my life. The successful entrepreneur and confident individual I had become possessed the resilience necessary to serve as an effective witness while maintaining the professional composure required for credible testimony. Detective Chen's investigation methodology involved cross-referencing Michael's fraudulent identity with missing persons reports, identity theft cases, and financial fraud investigations from multiple jurisdictions. Her systematic approach recognized that criminals who demonstrated Michael's level of sophistication in identity manipulation were likely to have engaged in similar activities in other locations before settling in Portland. The preliminary results of Detective Chen's background investigation revealed that David Thompson's educational credentials from a prestigious East Coast university were fabricated, his claimed employment history with a major financial services firm was false, and his Social Security number belonged to a deceased individual whose identity had been stolen for fraudulent purposes. These discoveries confirmed that Michael's deception extended far beyond relationship fraud into professional identity theft and document forgery. The legal framework governing Michael's criminal liability encompassed multiple felony charges including bigamy, identity theft, fraud, and forgery that carried substantial penalties if prosecution resulted in conviction. The district attorney's office would need to evaluate the strength of evidence and determine appropriate charges based on the investigation's findings and the testimony of witnesses who had observed his deceptive behavior. The community impact of Michael's fraud extended beyond our family to affect the broader Portland business and social networks, where he had established relationships based on his false identity. Detective Chen's investigation would need to determine whether other individuals or organizations had suffered financial or personal harm as a result of trusting someone whose entire professional and personal identity was fabricated. The wedding venue management at St. Catherine's Cathedral cooperated fully with the police investigation, while expressing concern about the reputational impact of having hosted what appeared to be an attempted, bigamous ceremony. Their documentation of the event and willingness to provide witness testimony demonstrated the serious consequences that criminal behavior creates for innocent third parties who become unwillingly involved in fraudulent activities. The media attention generated by the dramatic circumstances of Michael's exposure during a wedding ceremony created additional challenges for managing the investigation while protecting the privacy and emotional well-being of family members who were struggling to process the trauma of discovering they had been victimized by elaborate deception. Detective Chen's experience with high-profile cases enabled her to balance public interest with the need to preserve evidence and protect victims from additional harm. The support network that emerged to assist Vanessa and our family during this crisis demonstrated the value of maintaining strong community relationships and the importance of accepting help during periods of overwhelming challenge. Church members, family friends, and professional colleagues provided practical assistance and emotional support that enabled us to focus on healing and recovery rather than becoming consumed by logistical complications. The financial investigation into Michael's activities revealed that he had accumulated substantial debts under his false identity, while maintaining an expensive lifestyle that exceeded his legitimate income sources. His deceptive practices had enabled him to obtain credit cards, loans, and other financial obligations that would ultimately become the responsibility of the institutions that had been defrauded, rather than the victims who had been manipulated into relationships with him. The psychological profile that emerged from Detective Chen's investigation suggested that Michael possessed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic behavior patterns that made him capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions without experiencing normal emotional responses such as guilt or remorse about the harm his actions caused to innocent victims. This clinical assessment provided context for understanding how he had been able to sustain multiple fraudulent relationships simultaneously. The timeline reconstruction of Michael's activities during the 3 years since his departure from our marriage revealed a systematic pattern of identity manipulation and relationship fraud that demonstrated calculated criminal behavior rather than impulsive responses to personal or financial pressures. His activities suggested experience with similar deceptions in other locations and raised concerns about additional victims who might not yet have been identified. The evidence collection process required careful documentation of all materials related to Michael's false identity and fraudulent activities to ensure that criminal prosecution could proceed effectively while protecting the rights of all parties involved. Detective Chen's thorough approach to evidence preservation reflected her understanding that complex fraud cases often required extensive preparation to achieve successful outcomes in court proceedings. The victim impact assessment conducted as part of the investigation revealed that both Vanessa and I had suffered significant financial and emotional harm as a result of Michael's criminal behavior, though our injuries manifested in different ways that reflected the distinct nature of our relationships with him. The documentation of these impacts would be crucial for determining appropriate restitution and sentencing recommendations if criminal prosecution resulted in conviction. The community response to news of the investigation demonstrated widespread shock and concern about the possibility that other sophisticated fraudsters might be operating within Portland's business and social networks without detection. Detective Chen's investigation would contribute to broader awareness about identity fraud risks and the importance of thorough background verification before entering into significant personal or financial relationships. The transformation of what should have been a joyous family celebration into a criminal investigation created profound challenges for everyone involved, though the ultimate exposure of Michael's deception would prevent additional victims from suffering similar harm. The courage required to speak truth during the wedding ceremony had initiated a process that would hold a dangerous criminal accountable while protecting the broader community from his continued fraudulent activities. The investigation's progression would determine whether justice could be achieved for the multiple victims of Michael's elaborate deception while establishing legal precedents that might deter similar criminal behavior in the future. The strength I had developed through surviving abandonment and rebuilding my life independently had enabled me to serve as an effective advocate for truth and accountability, when circumstances required someone to act decisively despite personal cost and social pressure. The expansion of Detective Chen's investigation during the following week revealed complexities that transformed what initially appeared to be an isolated case of bigamy and identity fraud into evidence of a sophisticated criminal network operating across multiple states. The systematic nature of Michael's deception suggested coordination with other individuals who possessed expertise in document forgery, identity manipulation, and financial fraud that exceeded the capabilities of a single criminal acting independently. The breakthrough in understanding the broader scope of the criminal enterprise emerged when Detective Chen's cross-referencing of Michael's fraudulent credentials revealed connections to similar identity theft cases in Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix. The pattern of fabricated educational backgrounds, stolen social security numbers, and manufactured employment histories indicated a coordinated operation that provided fraudulent identities to multiple criminals seeking to avoid prosecution or establish new criminal ventures in different geographic locations. Federal Bureau of Investigation involvement became necessary when the multi-jurisdictional nature of the criminal network triggered federal statutes governing interstate fraud and organized criminal activity. Special Agent Patricia Williams assumed coordination of the expanded investigation, bringing resources and expertise that enabled comprehensive analysis of the criminal enterprise's structure, operations, and potential victims across the western United States. The psychological impact of discovering that Michael's betrayal was part of a larger criminal conspiracy created additional trauma for both Vanessa and myself, as we recognized that our personal suffering had been incidental to a calculated business operation that targeted vulnerable individuals for systematic exploitation. The revelation that our pain had been merely collateral damage in a profit-driven criminal enterprise added layers of violation and dehumanization to the emotional wounds we were already struggling to heal. Agent Williams' initial briefing revealed that the criminal network operated by identifying individuals seeking to escape legal problems, failed relationships, or financial difficulties. then providing them with complete false identities that enabled geographic relocation and assumption of fabricated backgrounds. The sophisticated nature of the identity packages suggested access to government databases, professional document production equipment, and extensive knowledge of verification procedures used by employers, financial institutions, and law enforcement agencies. The financial analysis conducted by federal investigators revealed that Michael had paid approximately $50,000 for his David Thompson identity package, indicating that the criminal network generated substantial revenues through their fraudulent services. The pricing structure discovered through seized communications suggested that more comprehensive identity packages, including false professional licenses and educational credentials, commanded prices exceeding $100,000 from clients seeking to infiltrate high-security professions. The victim identification process undertaken by Agent Williams's task force revealed that the criminal network had facilitated identity fraud, affecting hundreds of individuals across multiple states, with financial losses totaling millions of dollars when combined with the emotional and psychological harm inflicted on victims who had been manipulated into relationships with criminals operating under false identities. The scope of the victimization challenged traditional approaches to investigating and prosecuting identity theft cases. My cooperation with the federal investigation required providing detailed testimony about Michael's behavior patterns, psychological manipulation techniques, and the specific methods he had used to establish credibility within Portland's business and social communities. The systematic documentation of these tactics would assist investigators in identifying similar criminal activities and developing prevention strategies to protect potential future victims. The strength and analytical capabilities I had developed through rebuilding my business career proved invaluable in assisting federal investigators with understanding the sophisticated deception techniques employed by the criminal network. My experience in conducting due diligence for business partnerships provided relevant expertise for analyzing the verification procedures that had failed to detect Michael's fraudulent credentials and fabricated background. The investigation's expansion revealed that Vanessa and I were among dozens of women who had been targeted by network participants, seeking to establish credible romantic relationships that would provide social camouflage for their criminal activities, while potentially generating additional victims through family and friend networks. The systematic nature of this targeting demonstrated that our suffering had been predetermined components of calculated criminal strategies, rather than unfortunate consequences of personal relationship failures. The documentation recovered from raids on network safe houses revealed detailed profiles of potential victims that included psychological assessments, financial evaluations, and vulnerability analyses that enabled criminals to tailor their deception strategies to exploit specific emotional and practical weaknesses. The clinical precision of these targeting materials demonstrated the predatory sophistication of the criminal enterprise and the extent of planning that preceded each fraudulent relationship. The communication intercepts obtained through federal wiretapping authorizations revealed that Michael had reported regularly to network coordinators about his progress in establishing his Portland identity and developing relationships that could be exploited for financial gain or criminal concealment. His romantic pursuit of Vanessa had been directed by supervisors who viewed our family as a valuable target for long-term exploitation and expansion of criminal operations. The revelation that Michael's apparent attraction to Vanessa had been a calculated business decision based on strategic analysis of our family's social connections and financial resources created profound additional trauma for my sister, as she recognized that even her most intimate moments with him had been performance rather than authentic emotion. The violation of discovering that her feelings had been manipulated for criminal purposes challenged fundamental assumptions about her ability to recognize genuine affection and trustworthy behavior. The broader implications of the criminal network's activities extended beyond individual victims to encompass systemic failures in background verification procedures used by employers, financial institutions, and government agencies. Agent Williams's investigation revealed that the sophisticated nature of the fraudulent identities had enabled network participants to obtain professional licenses, security clearances, and positions of trust that provided access to additional victims and criminal opportunities. The coordinated law enforcement response to dismantling the criminal network required cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies across multiple jurisdictions, demonstrating the complexity of addressing organized criminal enterprises that operated across traditional geographic and administrative boundaries. The investigation's success would depend on sustained coordination and resource allocation that exceeded the capabilities of individual law enforcement agencies. The media attention generated by the investigation's expansion created additional challenges for protecting victim privacy while maintaining public awareness about the sophisticated nature of identity fraud threats. Agent Williams's media strategy balanced the need for community education about criminal tactics with recognition that excessive publicity could compromise ongoing investigations and inflict additional harm on victims who were struggling to rebuild their lives. The support services required to address the needs of multiple victims across several states necessitated coordination between victim advocacy organizations, mental health professionals, and legal aid societies that possessed expertise in addressing the complex trauma associated with romantic fraud and identity manipulation. The scale of the victimization exceeded the capacity of traditional victim services programs and required innovative approaches to providing comprehensive assistance. The psychological counseling I received through federal victim services programs provided crucial support for processing the additional trauma associated with discovering that Michael's betrayal had been part of a calculated criminal conspiracy rather than a personal relationship failure. The recognition that my abandonment had been a predetermined component of criminal strategy rather than evidence of personal inadequacy contributed significantly to my emotional healing and recovery. The financial investigation into the criminal network's operations revealed sophisticated money laundering techniques that had enabled the organization to process millions of dollars in fraudulent revenues, while avoiding detection by financial crimes task forces. The complexity of their financial operations suggested coordination with additional criminal enterprises and access to professional expertise in offshore banking and currency manipulation. The international dimensions of the criminal network became apparent when investigators discovered connections to identity fraud operations in Canada and Mexico, indicating that the organization's reach extended beyond United States borders and required coordination with international law enforcement agencies. The global scope of the criminal enterprise demonstrated the sophisticated nature of modern organized crime and the challenges facing traditional approaches to criminal investigation and prosecution. The technological analysis of the network's communication systems revealed advanced encryption techniques and operational security measures that had enabled coordination of criminal activities while avoiding detection by law enforcement surveillance operations. The sophisticated nature of their technological infrastructure suggested access to expertise typically associated with intelligence agencies or advanced cybercriminal organizations. The legal framework for prosecuting the criminal network's activities required coordination between multiple federal and state jurisdictions, each with different statutes and procedural requirements that complicated efforts to achieve comprehensive accountability for the organization's crimes. The complexity of the legal challenges demonstrated the need for updated legislation that addressed the realities of modern organized criminal enterprises operating across traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The community impact assessment conducted by federal investigators revealed that the criminal network's activities had affected thousands of individuals through direct victimization, financial losses, and erosion of trust in institutions responsible for verifying personal and professional credentials. The broader social consequences of the organization's crimes extended far beyond the immediate harm inflicted on specific victims to encompass systemic damage to community safety and social cohesion. The prevention initiatives developed in response to the investigation's findings included enhanced background verification procedures, improved training for professionals responsible for credential verification, and expanded public education about sophisticated identity fraud techniques. These systemic improvements would contribute to protecting future potential victims while addressing the institutional vulnerabilities that had enabled the criminal network's successful operations. The personal transformation I experienced through participating in the federal investigation demonstrated how individual courage in confronting criminal behavior could contribute to broader social protection and criminal justice reform. The decision to speak truth at Vanessa's wedding ceremony had initiated a process that would ultimately protect hundreds of potential future victims from similar harm, while holding dangerous criminals accountable for their sophisticated predatory activities. The recovery process for victims of the criminal network would require sustained support and resources that extended far beyond traditional approaches to addressing identity theft and fraud. The psychological, financial, and social consequences of romantic fraud created complex healing challenges that demanded innovative therapeutic interventions and comprehensive support services tailored to the specific nature of relationship-based criminal victimization. The comprehensive nature of the federal investigation required sustained cooperation from both Vanessa and myself over several months, creating opportunities for deeper healing and sisterly reconciliation that had seemed impossible during the years following Michael's initial abandonment. The shared experience of discovering we had both been victimized by the same sophisticated criminal network provided common ground for rebuilding our relationship while processing the complex trauma associated with romantic fraud and systematic deception. The specialized therapy program recommended by Federal Victim Services addressed the unique psychological challenges associated with romantic fraud, where victims must simultaneously process betrayal in intimate relationships and recognition that their emotional responses had been manipulated for criminal purposes. Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating victims of organized criminal activity, provided individual and family counseling that enabled us to understand the sophisticated manipulation techniques employed by the criminal network. The therapeutic framework Dr. Foster utilized emphasized that victims of romantic fraud often experienced more severe psychological trauma than those who suffered other forms of financial crime, because the violations occurred within contexts of intimacy and trust that are fundamental to emotional well-being and personal identity. The systematic nature of the deception created wounds that affected basic assumptions about safety, judgment, and the ability to recognize trustworthy behavior in future relationships. Vanessa's recovery process involved confronting the devastating realization that her fairy tale romance had been a calculated business operation designed to exploit her emotional vulnerabilities and family connections for criminal gain. The clinical precision with which the criminal network had analyzed her personality traits and relationship patterns created profound questions about her ability to recognize authentic affection and make sound judgments about potential romantic partners. The support group sessions facilitated by Dr. Foster included other victims of the criminal network from across the western United States, providing opportunities to share experiences and coping strategies with individuals who understood the unique challenges associated with recovering from systematic romantic fraud. The group dynamic demonstrated that our victimization was part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior rather than evidence of personal inadequacy or poor judgment. The financial counseling services provided through federal victim assistance programs addressed the complex economic consequences of identity fraud and romantic deception, including credit damage, fraudulent debts, and lost assets that required systematic resolution through legal procedures and coordination with financial institutions. The comprehensive nature of the criminal network's activities had created financial complications that extended far beyond immediate monetary losses to encompass long-term credit and identity protection challenges. My role as a key witness in the federal prosecution required extensive preparation and testimony that challenged me to maintain professional composure while recounting deeply personal experiences of abandonment and betrayal. The systematic documentation of Michael's deception techniques and the criminal network's operational methods provided crucial evidence for achieving successful prosecution while contributing to broader law enforcement understanding of sophisticated fraud schemes. The strength I had developed through 3 years of independent rebuilding proved invaluable during the prosecution phase, as my business experience with complex negotiations and high-stakes presentations enabled me to provide clear, credible testimony under aggressive cross-examination by defense attorneys attempting to discredit the government's case. The professional competence I had cultivated through entrepreneurial success translated directly into effectiveness as a witness in criminal proceedings. The collaborative relationship that developed between federal prosecutors and victim advocates demonstrated innovative approaches to addressing the complex needs of individuals who had suffered harm through organized criminal activity. The prosecution strategy balanced the need for successful criminal convictions with recognition that the legal process could either contribute to victim healing or create additional trauma depending on how proceedings were conducted. The community education initiatives that emerged from the federal investigation provided opportunities for both Vanessa and myself to transform our victimization into advocacy for increased awareness about sophisticated fraud techniques and improved protection for vulnerable populations. The speaking engagements and educational presentations we conducted with law enforcement agencies and community organizations enabled us to prevent additional victims while contributing to systemic improvements in fraud detection and prevention. The media strategy developed by federal authorities balanced the need for public education about criminal tactics with protection of victim privacy and ongoing investigation integrity. The controlled release of information about the criminal network's operations provided community awareness without compromising prosecutorial objectives or inflicting additional harm on individuals who were struggling to rebuild their lives following systematic deception. The family reconciliation process required addressing years of strained relationships and misunderstandings that had developed following Michael's initial disappearance and my subsequent relocation to Seattle. The shared experience of discovering we had both been targeted by the same criminal enterprise provided context for healing conversations that acknowledged the complex factors contributing to our previous conflicts, while establishing foundation for renewed sisterly support. My parents' response to discovering the true nature of Michael's behavior included recognition that their criticism of my decision to rebuild independently rather than waiting for his return had been based on incomplete understanding of the criminal dimensions of his abandonment. Their acknowledgement of my strength and wisdom in creating a successful new life provided validation that contributed significantly to family healing and improved relationships. The therapeutic process revealed that my success in rebuilding professionally and personally had equipped me with psychological resources and practical capabilities that enabled effective response to the crisis created by discovering Michael's continued criminal activity. The confidence and analytical skills developed through entrepreneurial achievement provided foundation for serving as an effective advocate for both individual victims and systemic reform initiatives. The legal proceedings against the criminal network required testimony from dozens of victims across multiple jurisdictions, creating a community of survivors who supported each other through the challenging process of confronting their victimizers in court, while contributing to successful prosecution outcomes. The collaborative nature of the legal process demonstrated how individual courage could combine with institutional resources to achieve justice for vulnerable populations. The comprehensive nature of the criminal enterprise's operations became fully apparent during trial proceedings, when evidence revealed that the network had facilitated hundreds of fraudulent identities while generating millions of dollars in illicit revenues through systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals seeking romantic relationships and social connections. The scale of the criminal activity validated the significance of my decision to speak truth at Vanessa's wedding ceremony. The sentencing phase of the criminal proceedings provided opportunities for victim impact statements that enabled survivors to articulate the personal and financial consequences of the network's criminal activities, while contributing to judicial understanding of appropriate punishment for sophisticated fraud schemes. The collective testimony of victims demonstrated the profound harm caused by romantic fraud and the need for substantial penalties to deter similar criminal behavior. The restitution process established through federal court proceedings addressed some of the financial harm caused by the criminal network's activities, though the complex nature of identity fraud and romantic deception created challenges in quantifying economic losses and establishing appropriate compensation for psychological trauma. The legal framework for addressing victim compensation in complex fraud cases required innovative approaches that recognized both tangible and intangible harm. The professional development opportunities that emerged from my involvement in the federal investigation included consulting relationships with law enforcement agencies seeking to improve their understanding of sophisticated fraud schemes and victim services organizations developing programs to address the unique needs of romantic fraud survivors. These professional engagements enabled me to transform personal trauma into expertise that contributed to broader social protection efforts. The relationship rebuilding process between Vanessa and myself required extensive communication about our different responses to trauma and the various coping strategies we had developed for processing betrayal and violation. The therapeutic guidance provided by Dr. Foster enabled us to understand how our distinct personalities and life experiences had influenced our recovery approaches, while identifying common ground for mutual support and understanding. The prevention advocacy work that became central to my post-investigation activities included development of educational materials, and presentation programs that increased public awareness about sophisticated identity fraud techniques, while providing practical guidance for recognizing and avoiding romantic fraud schemes. The systematic approach to prevention education reflected my business background and commitment to creating measurable impact through organized efforts. The support network expansion that resulted from participation in victim advocacy activities provided ongoing relationships with other survivors and professionals who understood the complex challenges associated with recovering from systematic criminal victimization. These connections created resources for continued healing, while enabling collaborative efforts to improve protection for potential future victims. The personal transformation that resulted from successfully navigating the investigation and prosecution process demonstrated how confronting criminal behavior and contributing to justice efforts could accelerate healing while creating meaning from traumatic experiences. The evolution from victim to advocate to prevention specialist illustrated the potential for individuals to transform personal suffering into broader social contribution through sustained commitment to truth and accountability. The systemic improvements in fraud detection and prevention that resulted from the federal investigation's findings included enhanced background verification procedures, improved training for professionals responsible for credential authentication, and expanded interagency cooperation for addressing organized criminal enterprises operating across traditional jurisdictional boundaries. These institutional changes would protect countless potential victims from similar harm. The recognition that individual courage in speaking difficult truths could catalyze comprehensive law enforcement responses and systemic social improvements provided profound validation for the decision to interrupt Vanessa's wedding ceremony, despite the immediate social and family costs. The transformation of personal trauma into broader community protection demonstrated the potential impact of moral courage when circumstances require action, despite uncertainty about outcomes. The federal courthouse in Portland represented the culmination of 18 months of investigation, preparation, and psychological recovery as I prepared to testify against Michael Rodriguez and his criminal associates in what had become one of the largest identity fraud prosecutions in the Pacific Northwest's legal history. The marble corridors and imposing architecture of the judicial building created an atmosphere of gravity that reflected the serious nature of the criminal charges and the potential impact of the proceedings on dozens of victims seeking justice and accountability. United States Attorney Jennifer Morrison had assembled a prosecution team that included specialists in organized crime, financial fraud, and victim advocacy. Recognizing that the complex nature of the criminal network required comprehensive legal expertise and sensitive handling of witness testimony from individuals who had suffered profound personal and financial harm. The systematic approach to case preparation demonstrated the federal government's commitment to achieving successful prosecution outcomes while supporting victim recovery and community protection. The defense strategy employed by Michael's legal team focused on portraying him as a victim of circumstances and psychological manipulation rather than a willing participant in organized criminal activity. Defense attorney Robert Caldwell attempted to minimize Michael's culpability by emphasizing his subordinate role within the criminal network, while arguing that his romantic relationships with both Vanessa and myself represented genuine emotional connections rather than calculated deception for financial gain. The jury selection process required careful evaluation of potential jurors' ability to understand complex financial crimes and sophisticated manipulation techniques while maintaining objectivity about cases involving intimate relationship fraud. The educational background and life experiences of selected jurors would significantly influence their capacity to comprehend the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise and the calculated psychology employed to exploit vulnerable victims. My preparation for testimony involved extensive collaboration with federal prosecutors to ensure that my account of Michael's behavior would provide clear evidence of criminal intent, while maintaining credibility under aggressive cross-examination by defense attorneys seeking to discredit government witnesses. The systematic documentation of Michael's deception techniques and their impact on both individual victims and broader community safety would be crucial for achieving successful prosecution outcomes. The opening statements presented by both prosecution and defense teams established competing narratives about the nature of the criminal network and the level of responsibility attributable to individual participants. Attorney Morrison's presentation emphasized the sophisticated planning and coordination required to execute the identity fraud scheme, while defense attorney Caldwell portrayed the defendants as individuals who had been exploited by more sophisticated criminal organizers. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the scope and structure of the criminal network, through expert witnesses who explained the technical aspects of identity fraud and the financial mechanisms used to launder proceeds from fraudulent activities. Federal agents presented evidence gathered through surveillance operations, financial analysis, and document examination that demonstrated the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise and its impact on victims across multiple states. The psychological expert testimony provided by Dr. Rachel Sterling, a clinical psychologist specializing in criminal behavior and victim trauma, educated the jury about the sophisticated manipulation techniques employed by romantic fraud perpetrators and the profound psychological harm inflicted on individuals who discovered that intimate relationships had been fabricated for criminal purposes. Her analysis of the criminal network's targeting strategies demonstrated the calculated nature of victim selection and exploitation methods. The presentation of documentary evidence required careful explanation of complex financial records, fraudulent identity documents, and communication intercepts that revealed the criminal network's operational procedures and coordination mechanisms. The systematic nature of the evidence demonstrated that the criminal enterprise had operated as a sophisticated business organization rather than a collection of individual criminals pursuing independent fraudulent activities. The victim testimony phase of the trial provided opportunities for survivors of the criminal network to describe their experiences while contributing to judicial understanding of the personal and financial consequences of systematic romantic fraud. The collective testimony of multiple victims from different geographic locations demonstrated the broad scope of the criminal enterprise and the consistent patterns of deception employed across various operational territories. My testimony represented a pivotal moment in the prosecution's case, as my detailed knowledge of Michael's behavior patterns and my professional background in business analysis enabled me to provide comprehensive evidence about the systematic nature of his deceptive activities. The strength and confidence I had developed through 3 years of independent rebuilding allowed me to maintain credibility and composure under intensive cross-examination by defense attorneys attempting to portray me as a vindictive ex-wife, seeking revenge rather than a credible witness to criminal behavior. The cross-examination strategy employed by defense attorney Caldwell focused on challenging my emotional objectivity and suggesting that my business success following Michael's departure demonstrated that I had not suffered significant harm from his abandonment. The attempt to minimize the impact of his criminal behavior by emphasizing my subsequent achievements reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma recovery and the strength required to rebuild after systematic betrayal and financial devastation. The redirect examination conducted by Attorney Morrison provided opportunities to clarify the relationship between personal resilience and criminal victimization, emphasizing that successful recovery from trauma does not diminish the severity of criminal behavior or the need for appropriate legal accountability. My testimony about the systematic nature of Michael's deception and its impact on multiple victims contributed to establishing the criminal intent and coordination required for successful prosecution under federal organized crime statutes. Vanessa's testimony provided crucial evidence about the specific techniques Michael had employed to establish credibility and manipulate her emotions during their courtship period. Her detailed account of his fabricated personal history and the systematic way he had integrated himself into our family's social network demonstrated the calculated planning that had preceded his romantic approach and the deliberate nature of his deceptive behavior. The emotional impact of Vanessa's testimony was profound, as her description of discovering that her deepest feelings had been manipulated for criminal purposes illustrated the unique psychological harm associated with romantic fraud. Her courage in confronting her victimizer in open court while contributing to successful prosecution efforts demonstrated the transformation from naive victim to empowered advocate that had characterized her recovery process. The financial expert testimony presented by forensic accountant Margaret Chen detailed the complex money laundering operations that had enabled the criminal network to process millions of dollars in fraudulent revenues while avoiding detection by financial crimes task forces. The sophisticated nature of the financial mechanisms demonstrated the professional level of criminal expertise involved in the enterprise, and the substantial resources required to establish and maintain such elaborate deceptive operations. The technology expert testimony explained the advanced communication systems and operational security measures employed by the criminal network to coordinate activities while avoiding law enforcement surveillance. The technical sophistication of their infrastructure indicated access to expertise typically associated with intelligence agencies or advanced cybercriminal organizations, suggesting connections to broader criminal enterprises operating at national or international levels. The defense presentation focused on portraying the defendants as individuals who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminal organizers and had not fully understood the extent of the illegal activities in which they were participating. Defense attorney Caldwell emphasized the personal backgrounds and psychological vulnerabilities of the defendants while arguing that they deserved lenient treatment based on their subordinate roles within the criminal hierarchy. The character witness testimony presented by the defense included family members and associates who described positive aspects of the defendants' personalities and their apparent capacity for rehabilitation. However, the prosecution's rebuttal emphasized that the systematic nature of the criminal behavior and the profound harm inflicted on multiple victims required substantial penalties regardless of individual characteristics or potential for future lawful behavior. The closing arguments presented by both prosecution and defense teams summarized the evidence and legal theories that had emerged during the trial proceedings. Attorney Morrison's presentation emphasized the need for accountability and deterrence in addressing sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploited vulnerable individuals through systematic romantic fraud, while defense attorney Caldwell argued for individualized consideration of each defendant's circumstances and level of culpability. The jury deliberation process required careful consideration of complex evidence and legal instructions, while reaching unanimous decisions about the guilt or innocence of multiple defendants, facing various charges related to identity fraud, money laundering, and organized criminal activity. The complexity of the case and the volume of evidence presented during the trial necessitated several days of deliberation before verdicts could be reached. The verdict announcement represented the culmination of nearly 2 years of investigation, prosecution preparation, and victim cooperation in seeking justice for the systematic exploitation perpetrated by the criminal network. The successful conviction of Michael Rodriguez and his criminal associates on multiple felony charges validated the courage of victims who had participated in the legal process while establishing legal precedents for addressing sophisticated romantic fraud schemes. The sentencing phase provided opportunities for victim impact statements that articulated the personal and financial consequences of the criminal network's activities while contributing to judicial understanding of appropriate punishment for systematic fraud schemes. The collective testimony of victims demonstrated the profound harm caused by romantic fraud and the need for substantial penalties to deter similar criminal behavior and protect potential future victims. The restitution orders established through the sentencing process addressed some of the financial harm caused by the criminal network's activities, though the complex nature of identity fraud and romantic deception created ongoing challenges in providing comprehensive compensation for both tangible losses and psychological trauma. The legal framework for victim compensation in complex fraud cases required innovative approaches that recognized the multifaceted nature of harm caused by systematic criminal exploitation. The successful conclusion of the federal prosecution created opportunities for both personal renewal and professional expansion that would have been unimaginable during the darkest periods following Michael's initial abandonment. The 18 months of investigation and trial proceedings had tested every aspect of the strength and resilience I had developed through independent rebuilding, while simultaneously establishing my credibility as an effective advocate for criminal justice reform and victim protection initiatives. The business consulting opportunities that emerged from my involvement in the federal case reflected recognition of my unique expertise in identifying sophisticated deception techniques and developing systematic approaches to fraud prevention. Several major corporations and government agencies sought my consultation services for improving their background verification procedures and training programs, designed to help employees recognize and respond to identity fraud attempts within their organizations. The expansion of my graphic design agency into a comprehensive business consulting firm specializing in risk assessment and fraud prevention represented a natural evolution of the analytical capabilities I had developed through entrepreneurial success and federal witness experience. The systematic approach to problem solving that had enabled successful business growth translated directly into expertise for helping organizations protect themselves and their stakeholders from sophisticated criminal enterprises. The specialized training programs I developed for law enforcement agencies addressed the unique challenges associated with investigating romantic fraud cases and supporting victims who had suffered complex psychological trauma through intimate relationship manipulation. The professional expertise I had gained through personal experience provided practical insights that complemented traditional law enforcement training while improving outcomes for both investigators and victims. The victim advocacy organization I established in partnership with other survivors of the criminal network created systematic support services for individuals recovering from romantic fraud and identity theft. The comprehensive approach to victim assistance addressed both immediate practical needs and long-term healing requirements, while providing educational resources that help survivors understand the criminal psychology behind their victimization and develop strategies for preventing future exploitation. The relationship between Vanessa and myself had evolved into a collaborative partnership that combined our complementary strengths and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals from sophisticated criminal predators. Her natural empathy and interpersonal skills provided crucial capabilities for victim outreach and support services, while my business expertise and analytical abilities enabled systematic program development and organizational management. The speaking engagements we conducted at universities, professional conferences, and community organizations provided platforms for education about sophisticated fraud techniques, while demonstrating the potential for survivors to transform personal trauma into meaningful social contribution. The systematic approach to prevention education reflected our shared understanding that comprehensive awareness campaigns could prevent countless individuals from experiencing similar victimization. The policy advocacy work we undertook with state and federal legislators addressed systemic vulnerabilities in background verification procedures and victim protection services that had enabled the criminal network to operate successfully for years without detection. Our professional presentations to legislative committees emphasized the need for enhanced coordination between law enforcement agencies and improved funding for specialized victim services programs. The academic research collaboration I initiated with criminology professors at Portland State University focused on developing comprehensive understanding of romantic fraud patterns and their psychological impact on victims across diverse demographic categories. The systematic documentation of criminal techniques and victim responses would contribute to improved prevention strategies while informing therapeutic interventions for individuals recovering from relationship-based criminal exploitation. The financial success of my expanded consulting business enabled significant charitable contributions to organizations providing services for victims of domestic violence, identity theft, and financial fraud. The systematic approach to philanthropic giving reflected my commitment to creating measurable impact through strategic resource allocation, while supporting grassroots organizations that possessed expertise in addressing specific aspects of criminal victimization. The professional recognition I received for my contributions to fraud prevention and victim advocacy included appointments to advisory committees for federal agencies responsible for consumer protection and criminal justice policy development. These positions provided opportunities to influence systematic improvements in institutional responses to sophisticated criminal enterprises, while ensuring that victim perspectives were incorporated into policy development processes. The mentorship relationships I established with other survivors of romantic fraud provided opportunities to share recovery strategies and professional development resources, while building networks of mutual support that extended across geographic boundaries. The systematic approach to peer mentorship recognized that individual healing often accelerated through meaningful connection with others who understood the unique challenges associated with recovering from intimate relationship manipulation. The media interviews and publication opportunities that resulted from my advocacy work provided platforms for educating broader audiences about sophisticated fraud techniques, while challenging common misconceptions about victim responsibility and recovery timelines. The professional presentation of complex information about criminal psychology and institutional responses demonstrated the importance of accurate public education for preventing additional victimization. The therapeutic practices I maintained through Dr. Foster's continued guidance provided ongoing support for processing the complex emotions associated with transformation from victim to advocate, while managing the professional demands of building a successful consulting business. The systematic approach to emotional health recognized that sustained advocacy work required careful attention to personal well-being and continued psychological development. The technology initiatives I developed for improving fraud detection capabilities included collaboration with cybersecurity firms and financial institutions, seeking to enhance their ability to identify sophisticated identity manipulation techniques. The systematic analysis of criminal methods provided practical insights for developing automated detection systems, while improving human operator training for recognizing subtle indicators of fraudulent activity. The international conference presentations I delivered addressed the global nature of organized identity fraud and the need for enhanced cooperation between law enforcement agencies across national boundaries. The systematic documentation of criminal network operations provided valuable intelligence for international efforts to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises, while protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. The family relationships that had been strained by Michael's initial abandonment and my subsequent geographic relocation experienced significant healing through our shared commitment to advocacy work and victim protection initiatives. The systematic approach to family reconciliation recognized that collective healing often strengthened individual recovery, while providing foundation for meaningful collaborative efforts to benefit broader communities. The professional development opportunities that emerged from my consulting work included advanced training in forensic accounting, criminal psychology, and organizational risk management that enhanced my capabilities for providing comprehensive fraud prevention services. The systematic approach to skill development reflected my commitment to maintaining expertise that would enable continued effectiveness in protecting organizations and individuals from sophisticated criminal threats. The legal consulting services I provided for other federal prosecutions of organized fraud cases enabled broader application of the insights gained through personal experience while contributing to successful outcomes for additional victim communities. The systematic documentation of effective prosecution strategies provided resources for law enforcement agencies addressing similar criminal enterprises while improving coordination between federal and local jurisdictions. The educational curriculum development projects I undertook with business schools and criminal justice programs created systematic approaches to training future professionals in recognizing and responding to sophisticated fraud schemes. The comprehensive integration of theoretical knowledge and practical experience provided students with enhanced capabilities for protecting their future organizations and communities from criminal exploitation. The community partnership initiatives I established with local banks, credit unions, and consumer protection agencies created coordinated approaches to fraud prevention education, while improving resources available to individuals who discovered they had been victimized by identity theft or romantic manipulation. The systematic collaboration between diverse organizations enhanced overall community resilience against sophisticated criminal enterprises. The research publication projects I initiated documented the systematic relationship between romantic fraud victimization and broader patterns of organized criminal activity, while providing evidence-based recommendations for improving institutional responses to complex fraud cases. The professional presentation of research findings contributed to academic understanding of criminal psychology while informing policy development processes. The personal transformation I experienced through building a successful advocacy organization and consulting business demonstrated that individual healing could accelerate through meaningful contribution to community protection efforts, while creating sustainable financial security and professional fulfillment. The systematic integration of personal recovery and professional development provided a model for other survivors seeking to transform traumatic experiences into positive social impact. The long-term vision I developed for expanding fraud prevention initiatives included establishment of a national training institute that would provide comprehensive education for law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, and organizational security personnel. The systematic approach to institutional development reflected my commitment to creating lasting impact through sustainable educational programs that would protect countless individuals from sophisticated criminal exploitation. The international recognition of my fraud prevention expertise reached a pivotal moment when the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime extended an invitation to present research findings at their annual Global Conference on Transnational Organized Crime in Vienna. The opportunity to address delegates from over 100 nations represented the culmination of 5 years of systematic documentation and analysis of sophisticated identity fraud networks, demonstrating how individual courage in confronting criminal behavior could ultimately contribute to international policy development and victim protection initiatives. The comprehensive research presentation I delivered to the International Assembly detailed the operational structures and psychological manipulation techniques employed by organized romantic fraud enterprises, providing evidence-based recommendations for enhanced cooperation between national law enforcement agencies and improved standardization of victim protection services across international boundaries. The systematic analysis of criminal network operations revealed patterns that extended far beyond the specific case that had originated with Michael's deception at Vanessa's wedding ceremony. The diplomatic impact of my United Nations presentation created opportunities for consulting relationships with government agencies across Europe, Asia, and South America that were struggling to address sophisticated criminal enterprises operating within their jurisdictions. The systematic approach to fraud prevention that I had developed through personal experience and professional analysis provided practical frameworks that could be adapted to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining effectiveness against internationally coordinated criminal activities. The establishment of the International Fraud Prevention Institute represented the formalization of my commitment to creating systematic educational resources that would protect vulnerable populations worldwide from sophisticated criminal exploitation. The comprehensive curriculum development process involved collaboration with academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, and victim advocacy organizations across multiple continents to ensure that training programs addressed diverse cultural perspectives while maintaining scientific rigor and practical effectiveness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.